Hello, good morning, and welcome to Line by Line Bible Studies. It's too loud. We left off where Jesus had declared that give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and what is God's. That didn't make a lot of English. In response to the idea of, shall we pay tribute to Caesar? And this is through a series of, he has cast out the money changers. He has spoken parables against the establishment. And now the establishment is trying to see if they can catch him in his words. Some of the young Pharisees tried, the disciples of the Pharisees, and now come the Sadducees. The same day came to him the Sadducees, which say that there is no resurrection, and asked him, saying, Master, Moses said, if a man die and having no children, his brother shall marry his wife, and raise up seed unto his brother. Now there was, pardon me. Let's just keep reading it. Now there were with us 7 brethren, and the first, when he had married a wife, deceased, and having no issue, left his wife unto his brother. Likewise the second also, and the third unto the 7th. Likewise, and last of all, the woman died also. Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife shall she be of the 7? For they all had her. Jesus answered and said unto them, Ye do err, not knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God. Hold on one second. Let's go ahead and continue and read the whole little section. Well, let's just make sure we understand their story first, and then we can dispense with it. There were 7 brethren, and they all, and that's not where to start. You start at the beginning. All right, first of all, these guys don't believe in the resurrection. That was one of the critical differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees didn't believe in any sort of afterlife. And the idea of an afterlife is actually kind of ridiculous when you think about it. Afterlife? You're either alive or you're not. You know, they talk about afterlife. It's a funny thing. You know, it's a funny thing to refer to living people as dead, as Jesus will, say famously in just coming up. The resurrection is a doctrine that you can find in the Old Testament, but it's not in the law of Moses. It's in the prophets, and it's it is very sketchy. I think it's best. I think of Isaiah chapter 26. Wait, or am I thinking of? Yeah, Isaiah 26. Of course, the last chapter of Isaiah, Ezekiel, the valley of dry bones, and but it's not a heavily spoken of thing in the Old Testament, the idea of resurrection. Certainly not of like afterlife or, So being a Jew in the first century, it was very common for people not to, in certain sects, they didn't believe in an afterlife. It was this life. That's it. You gotta, here you are. You make the most of it. Obey the law of God. You will live long. And such is the fallen state of man that we die and we perish, and that's the end of it. And I do think that there is a truth in that, in the sense, I believe in the resurrection. But I also believe in death. I believe death is real. It's not an illusion. Because I think the majority of Christians today treat death as if it were an illusion. Meaning, well, they're not dead. They're somewhere else. This dead body is not them. The essence of who they are has traveled somewhere else. And you know, I don't. It's not. It's something I used to be a little more passionate about. But you know, on reflection on the idea of the resurrection, I realize that in my, you know, from the way I understand it, the way I believe it is that the moment you die, then you die, and then there's no time, no space, no experience. So the next experience you have, the very next moment, if you will, of experience, is the resurrection of the dead. So it will seem like a seamless break to from your subjective experience. You will not spend any time dead. The dead don't know anything. They don't spend time. I mean, nobody spends time. You know, people will ask me, well, where are they? You know, what are they doing? What are they thinking? None of that. That's what death is. That's what I believe. And I believe that while one can make a strong case for the popular view of death using the scriptures, I do believe that that is an interpretation that does not account for all the scriptures and never does. Well, maybe they do. I don't know. I guess what I would say is certainly not to my satisfaction, you know. And I used to believe that way. So, I mean, I'm already a convert to the other point of view. And of course, people always say, oh, that's what the Jehovah's Witnesses believe. It's like, you know, as though a broken clock can't be right twice a day. Well, you know, it is. It's like, it's just because some, you know, that's always like, well, the Catholics believe in the Trinity. Same argument. You know, and I get it from people. But Trinitarians, when I say I believe in death, they're like, oh, that's what the Jehovah's Witnesses believe. It's like, well, thanks. It's like, that's not a logical argument. That's just, I don't know what you call that technically. It's not an appeal to authority. It's sort of like a reverse of the appeal. It's an appeal to the, well, they're wrong on other things, so they're wrong on everything. You know, and we can't be wrong, but we have perfect doctrine. We all strive. You know, so I'm not hostile towards people because they disagree with me. I would just ask that they not be hostile towards me. I'm not convinced. I believe in the resurrection, which means I believe at the end of the world, God raises the dead. But when you die, it will be as though, you know, like, I also believe in a sense that they are already there and that God inhabits eternity. You know, and our sense of time as this linear flow of a ray shot out in one direction is not entirely, like, it is only the way we have experienced time and events. I remember watching a program on physics. It's like they were saying, like, they couldn't explain why events would never happen in reverse order. Now, that to me, I'm like, what, you can't explain that? That doesn't even make sense. I don't even know what that guy was talking about. I still don't. Events move forward. My brain cannot conceive of effect and then cause. You know, that doesn't seem right. But they said, and I'm like, well, and what it is I think they're talking probably from a mathematical or a laws of physics, quote unquote, point of view. I just realized the sweat jacket is really hot today, so I'm not going to sit here sweating for an hour. Oh. All right, that's better. It's nice and toasty here, I think. All right. So, the Sadducees denied the resurrection. I'm not going to make this a big, long thing about my point of view. Pharisees denied the resurrection. The Pharisees affirmed a resurrection. In fact, they had a doctrine. You can read about it in Luke. I mean, they believed in the afterlife. They believed in things like Abraham's bosom, the great gulf you read of in the book of Luke, in the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. The parable is all based on their traditions. It's not based on anything in the Old Testament, that's for sure, or anything taught in the Bible elsewhere. And I tend to think that the New Testament is an extension of the Old. It is not a reimagination of the Old. There's a direct order of descent. And everything that was changed as far as in the order of like everything that Christianity changed over from Judaism is discussed in the New Testament. I mean, they considered these problems that had to be addressed. So, I don't know, and I don't find that to be the case. In the New Testament, what I find is in the book of Acts, the apostles affirm the view that the dead are dead, and that a lot of those scriptures are never contended with, or I've never heard them contended with by people who are apologists for the, I'll call it the popular view, or the traditional view. Sometimes there's no argument from tradition. You can't say something is true because it's traditional or because it's popular. You have to support it with actual evidence, and I just find that it's a lot easier to explain away the scriptures that are contrary to my point of view in terms of like, well, you know, because everything has to be interpreted. And to deny that there are scriptures that like are somewhat contradictory on the subject is to just close your eyes to the problem. Is the thing people want to say, oh, it's all clearly one way. Well, all they're doing is closing their eyes to the problem. It's like with the nature of God and the Trinity. The Trinitarian position is this subtle, nuanced position that takes everything into account. Whereas you get the position of the modalists on one hand, who believe that there is no son, really. It's all just one God pretending to be different persons, or putting on different modes of being, or, you know, putting on different hats, so to speak. On the other hand, you have things like the Mormons, where they believe that Jesus is a created, separate, distinct being from God. And both those point of views exist in total opposition to each other, because they can't both be anything like, I mean, they're just totally contradictory. One says Jesus is a created thing. The other one says Jesus kind of doesn't exist. Jesus is the Father. The Father is Jesus. There's no distinct persons. They're just different modes, or what was the other word I use sometimes? I had a discussion. Well, whatever. But they are one being and one person. They don't like the word persons, you know, even specially defined. You got these two opposing ideas, and neither of them are synthesizing all the scriptures. Whereas the Trinitarian position does, you know? And I would say denying the resurrection is the wrong position, and having this sort of weird afterlife that doesn't fit in with everything. I remember even as a child trying to understand how death worked, reading the book of Revelation, and just, I'm like, if they're all judged at the end, you know, there's this big resurrection thing in the end of Revelation, and where are they getting everyone? Nobody, there shouldn't be anybody to resurrect, but then it becomes this, they go back for their bodies, blah, 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 whatever. Okay, they denied the resurrection. The Pharisees believed in a resurrection, though theirs had become, like I said, more of the modern view of like the afterlife. Meaning you die and you go to heaven or something. They didn't have heaven. You actually all went to hell. But in hell, there was where the good people go, like Abraham's bosom. And I don't know if they thought that they were waiting the final judgment, or if they had been judged, or it's just very unclear to me at times with these, when they start shuffling souls around. For me, it seems a lot simpler to just leave the souls where they are. A soul is a strange thing. It's, for one, souls don't have space, as far as I can tell. I remember there was that thing where they said, like, oh, the guy died and he lost a little weight. That was his soul. I don't think so. I think that's been debunked. They marveled and left their went away. Okay, wait. So the Sadducees come. They spin this yarn about the guy who has. Well, first they talk about Moses' law, which is the law that basically said, if your brother dies, he's married, and he had no seed, you had to, his next in line sibling had to take his wife and raise up seed to his brother, which meant that the child that was born would be reckoned as the brother's son, would have his brother's name on it. And I don't know how it would go after that, like if you were allowed to take another wife if you didn't like her or something. Well, you could write her a bill of divorcement. I guess that was plausible or whatever. But it's an ancient tradition. It had to do with, there's no, in the New Testament, there's never any, like, a lot, I get the feeling this law was not followed a lot. Because it's kind of a very sacrificial thing and difficult thing for someone to do. So anyways, I forgot exactly where that is, and I didn't even think of looking it up. Yeah, there was, there's a famous case but honestly, this is not even accurate. This is not, what they're saying is not even accurate. It may be in the law, but the famous case I can think of is in the case of the sons of Judah. Judah, who was the progenitor from which we get the name of the Jews, right? He was one of the 12 patriarchs. He was the Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. He was the fourth born son of Jacob, who was surnamed Israel. Or not surnamed, Jacob, who was named Israel by God. And he took a wife outside of outside of their race, okay? Outside of their nation. It's not just about race. You gotta understand. It wasn't entirely race. I mean, like Moses was married to a woman who displeased Miriam because she was darker skinned than their people. But she was of Midian, and that's a descendant of Abraham. And so they're considered kin, even if they are darker skinned. It had to do with kinship and culture more than it had to do with like what we would call modern notions of race or skin color. Though people could be just as racist, like maybe Miriam was being that way. But so it was more about kinship and culture when it talks about who you marry. So he'd married outside of Israel some heathen women. And I guess the implication is not just that they were foreign or of different genetic background, but they had foreign ways. And that is often the don't give your sons to be their husbands, don't take their daughters to be your wives, because they will turn the heart of the people away from their God, because they have other traditions, they have other laws, they have other ways of being in the world, and they will want to cling to their traditions. And so that's why they were to marry all within certain groups, people who were of the same tradition. So Judah, his son, I was thinking Pharez and Ezram, but it was his other sons with this other wife. And it's kind of a sordid story. The sons of Judah displeased God. And right off the top of my head, I don't remember how but this is what I'm saying is this story goes back to the patriarchs. It's in Genesis. Now, Genesis is called the books of Moses. But this is a reflection of a tradition that's earlier than Moses. So Moses did not make this up. It was a custom that was already in place. So, in that story, basically, the brother dies, and then his younger sibling is supposed to marry his wife, and refuses. And when he has sex with her, but then he withdraws and spills his seed on the ground. Now, for Catholics, that right there is why they condemn masturbation of any sort. And even in a in a married setting, they would say whatever, or condoms or anything like that. Any sort of birth control. But I do disagree with them that it's not about birth. It's the fact that he didn't want to give his brother a son. That's why it was wrong. It wasn't simply because he was not wanting to have a baby, but it was because he was obliged under the laws and customs of those times to give his brother a son, and he refused. But he was he pleasured himself anyways. So the idea that you are obliged constantly to have children is not biblical. It encourages the women to bear children, but it's not. I don't think using birth control, though God knows I haven't used it very much. Having 8 children, obviously, but I don't think that birth control is wrong. I mean, maybe that's something people would want to know because I do have so many children. But it's not because I don't believe in birth control. I mean, they aren't all 9 months apart. God knows they could have been. They're spaced out and stuff, and that's not pure. That's not just some accident. So, and he was slain. I forgot his name. So the two, and then the sordid story ends up with Judah ends up taking her, not exactly the wife. She tricks him. She dresses up like a prostitute, and Judah gives her his ring and his signet, or his staff, as tokens for payment. When he comes back to pay her, she's gone. Then he finds out his daughter-in-law is pregnant. He wants to have her stoned. And then she shows him the ring and the signet of who had gotten her pregnant, himself. Because no one had given her the child that she felt that she was due from them. She'd married his first son, then his second son, and they both done, well, at least the first one never had a son. The second one did wickedly towards her, at least in the context of the customs. And then Judah had not given, he had a third son. And he did not want to give him because he thought she's toxic. He's going to die too. Did he have a third son? I thought he did. Oh well. Well, you can look that up in Genesis. So that law of succession, their thought is this: is that they think, well, if there's an afterlife, it's going to continue on like this life. You're going to have your wife and your kids. At least you still be in the family way, If she was your wife on earth, she should be your wife in heaven. In fact, I remember hearing a comedian joke about this, and it was funny. Because you'll hear people to this day say, oh, now I can be with Harold forever. I'm going to die and we're going to be together and I'll be back with my husband when they die. They think they'll be together forever in heaven. And so their contention is basically this: well, how are you going to deal with all these relationships? They all had her. I mean, isn't that going to be awkward? And they thought, oops, there's a little problem with they thought, well, we've got him now. As far as we've got him in a question, if we can't, this is not meant to. The first question was made to entrap him. This one is intended to make him look like a fool. Because to them, the idea of resurrection is silly. Jesus answered and said unto them, Ye do err, not knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. But as touching the resurrection of the dead... All right, well, let's just... Actually, before I read that, let's just deal with this so I don't have to deal with 2 points at once. So, you don't know the Scriptures, you don't know the power of God. First of all, in the denying the resurrection, the Scriptures, I mean, like I said, Isaiah chapter 26. I'll read a couple of resurrection scriptures here from the Old Testament. Certainly there are passages that imply resurrection, right? But Isaiah certainly said things that definitely... I mean, this is the most obvious one I can think of. Thy dead men shall live, together with my dead body shall they arise. Awake and sing, ye that dwell in the dust, for thy dew is as the dew of herbs, and the earth shall cast out the dead. That last part is a bit of a not the way it sounds. Because Raphaim is the word dead, and it's not the usual word for being dead. It refers to sort of evil spirits or the evil dead. You know, so I mean, I guess if you think of it that way. And then I guess I also think of like Isaiah 66. Where it's not so obvious. But definitely is connected. So I'm not going to go to that. But then in Ezekiel, that the valley of dry bones. So it's in the Scriptures. It's implied by the Scriptures that God has in mind more for man. That God has in mind to redeem man from the curse he placed on man from our beginning. When we opened our eyes and we saw each other's nakedness, and we immediately began to slay and abuse one another. That's, you know, the cost of having your eyes open and seeing your own nakedness. It means you see your vulnerabilities. And it means you also have access to the vulnerabilities of others. Like, I know if I twist a knife like this, it will hurt. And then you do it. Well, that's sin. Before we go to the next part, let's just say subscribe to Line by Line Bible Studies and click on the like button. And that's my website. That's my other YouTube page. You can find the links to those in the description below. If you have questions, you can send them to questions@oraclesofgod.org. If you immediately want an answer to a question, you can post it in the chat, in the the live chat in the stream. If you put a question in the the comments section, I try to watch out for that, but I'd like YouTube does not give consistent notifications because there have been comments that I was not notified of. But if I am notified of your comments, I will go there and answer it, because I certainly don't have any overwhelming number of comments on the video, so I got plenty of room to answer. I can answer questions directly in the study. Also, if you want to send a message here, you can also suggest a topical study or something if that's something that interests you. And then, oh no, Paul, not that. There we go. Okay. Anyways, I haven't checked my email since yesterday, but I just don't expect anything. I'll check it tomorrow or right after the study. So let's get back to Matthew. Sorry, let's keep this organized. Okay. To understand, now the New Testament expands on the idea of resurrection and the idea of afterlife, if you will. Though I don't like that term because it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't really make sense. It's life from the dead. Resurrection is to be alive again. It's not like, well, where are the dead? The dead are dead. If you're dead, you're dead. If you're alive, you're alive. There's no they're two polar opposite things. You know what I mean? Like, my hand is alive. If I cut it off, it'll die. And then it'll be dead. Like, it's interesting to me that in this life, we know the difference between life and death. I mean, we do. We see examples of it constantly. We know this isn't alive. It's not. I mean, it's dead. It's completely not a living thing. And we know the difference between living things and non-living things. Though I know at the very small level, it becomes very difficult to tell the difference. Like crystals grow, but they're not alive in any sense that we would understand. Viruses multiply, but it's not clear whether these things are actually alive. Certainly not in the sense that we think of it. But certainly we know the difference between human life and human unlife. What about afterlife? Afterlife is something that people garner from looking at scriptures. Scriptures like the one we're about to read. Because this one is not obvious. It's not obviously in support of the way I view things. But what I would say is this, is it does not rule it out. Meaning, some scriptures are so strongly in opposition to things that they actually rule out another idea. It's like that seems like that is... So this idea makes the other one, it excludes it completely from consideration. But I don't know of any scriptures, and I know them all, that exclude the idea of death and resurrection. So that God has power and does things differently maybe than we would understand. When he says, nor the power of God. The resurrection is not going to be like this world. The resurrection is not going to be according to the powers that we now experience. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God, of God in heaven. They are like the angels. They don't get married. And in that sense, it also implies that they don't really have gender. You know what I mean? Or let's say not gender, well, whatever. They don't have... Because gender is now like a weird word, apparently. It doesn't... It's like not the same thing as sex. Well, wait, what? It's like... It always was before. Everyone's always trying to play around with the language, Screw around with everything. So nobody can understand each other. And that is the story of Babel. They're trying to build something big. They call it the globalist world. And all it results in is further fracturing. You can't build too big, because you'll never get everyone to agree on how it ought to be built. And so you're better off not trying to build so big. And when they succeed, and the funny thing is they're going to succeed building big, sort of. The Antichrist's success in building big and having a sort of a global, a worldwide kingdom. That kingdom is really constituted in a bizarre way. 7 heads and 10 horns. 7 heads. It's like, that's not a proper sort of hierarchy or, government. Government there's few at the top. You don't go like emanating from the bottom and have all these heads coming up. All these leaders from one thing. You can't have 7 kings lead one thing. Then they're not really leading at all. They're just pulling against each other. It's a very chaotic image. It's meant to be a upturning of normal order. As touching the resurrection of the dead, have you not read that which was spoken unto you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. That's what he said to Moses out of the burning bush, I believe. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Now, when you read that, there you go. You can say, well, so they're alive. They're in heaven. And that's certainly a reading you can do. And that's an easy reading to make. It's an easy argument to make. But, I juxtapose it with scriptures. It's like, and people don't like this when you say, well, what about this? What about that scripture? But the thing is, when you wrestle with the scriptures as long as I have, you realize there are many scriptures to wrestle with. And some issues are not, while it seems good here, it only seems good because, well, when you walk into a situation with a particular point of view, or even the opposite point of view, there's a strong prejudicial component that begins to be at work. It's like you read that and you think like, oh, well, maybe I'm wrong. Or you say, aha, this means I'm right. If I want to reassure myself, I need go no further than Acts chapter 2. And these were, Peter was a disciple of Jesus, an apostle. And I'm going to bring it up a bit because it's worth bringing up. Because there are other ways of interpreting what Jesus said. Because remember, he's talking to people who don't believe in the resurrection. They don't believe anyone's going to be raised from the dead, ever. That when you die and you're dead. Forever. You know what I mean? That's what they believe. So when Jesus says he is God, not God of the dead, but of the living, what he's saying is that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived to God. It doesn't mean they necessarily literally are having a life in heaven in this moment in time in the world. Because the world is not heaven. God inhabits eternity. He in the book of Revelation, John is exposed to all these future events. How did that happen? Was it just vision? Maybe it was. Was he really transported into the future? Maybe he was. I don't know what the possibilities. I know what the possibilities are, but I don't know what the actuality was. Like, what did he actually observe? Was it all just visions in his head? And that's fine. But he was shown visions of things that are real to God. I don't think God is like trapped in our time frame. We have a singular dimension of time. I remember reading, I forgot the title of the book, but I remember the author, Hugh Ross. And a lot of people don't like him because he's one of these, scientific Christians who apologizes for the Bible in terms of the age of the earth being much longer, right, than the fundamentalist point of view would say. Meaning he thinks the earth is very old, and he believes in the day-age theory of Genesis, which means that you read he still kind of reads Genesis literally, because he's still like, okay, the first day is like, well, you'd have to take it from him as far as like, he has lots of books if you're interested in that sort of detailed analysis of, trying to reconcile the Bible with science, which is something I don't even find interesting anymore, because I don't think I don't think the Bible has to be justified scientifically. It's ridiculous. It's a book of miracles. I mean, it's like science can't touch it. Can't touch it. It's not a book of the history of the world day by day for, though sometimes it feels like that. Some of that is an artificial perception on our part. That's my opinion. Well, in Acts, chapter 2, I use this scripture all the time, but hey, why not? Men and brethren, let me freely speak unto you of the patriarch David, that he is both dead and buried, and his sepulchre is with us to this day. Therefore, being a prophet, and knowing that God hath sworn an oath unto him, that of the fruit of his loins, according to the flesh, he would raise up Christ to sit on his throne, he, seeing before, spake of the resurrection of Christ, that his soul was not left in hell, neither did his flesh see corruption. This Jesus hath God raised up, whereof you are all witnesses. Therefore, being by the right hand of God, exalted, and having received of the Father the promise of the Holy Ghost, he has shed forth this which ye have now seen here. He's speaking on Pentecost Day, of the power that was poured out on them, which power I also received. Okay. I wanted the next one. Verse 34. For David is not ascended into the heavens, but he saith himself, the Lord said unto my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make thy enemies thy footstool. And this isn't the only place, but I mean, it's quite. But he says David is dead and buried. He is not ascended into the heavens. All right, there are many such like scriptures, and you can place them now. Now here's the thing. Well, but Paul, but no. Matthew 22. He is not God of the dead, but God of the living. David's dead. Is he not God of David also? So was Peter contradicting Jesus? Wrestle with these questions. That's the thing, is like Peter seems to contradict Jesus. If you can't handle that, then you're never going to be any kind of a worthwhile teacher of the Bible. Because if you can't sort that out somehow, you're lying on some level. Either to yourself, which is easy to do. It's easy to lie to yourself. I remember doing it. I remember coming to, and it's not always lying to yourself per se, certainly not consciously. But I remember starting to feel about things I would tell myself and ways I would assure myself about certain interpretations. I remember thinking to myself after a while that I just started feeling uncomfortable with the way I was telling myself to interpret things. Because I didn't feel like it was completely honest about what I was reading. Peter says David is dead and buried, and his sepulchre is with us today. David is dead. So God is not God of David. Or is he? And again, it depends on the sense in which it was intended. And and you can break this down on so many places where the Bible seems to be contradicting itself. And that's all right. The skeptics will have field days with it. It doesn't matter. We're believers, and we need to sort these things out in the most honest way we can. People are always on such the defensive, afraid of people's faith being ripped up. The number one thing that's going to destroy people's faith is ignorance. If they are ignorant of things in the Bible, then someone comes along and presents to them something that's like a problem they haven't dealt with, their pastor has ignored. You know what I mean? They never heard about it. They, well, look at the Bible says this here, it says that there. And it's like, this isn't right. This can't be the perfect word of God or whatever, And this is what happens to the adult children of fundamentalists who were fed a singular line of thought and not instructed in how to contend with the difficult ideas presented in the scriptures. Because our traditions will not always, a lot of traditions Christians have don't fit in with things said in the Bible. And what it is, at some point along the line, someone made a decision. All right? You're not aware of this decision because you just received the doctrine from somebody else. But they made a decision. Now, we're going to compare Acts 2 with this passage. God is not God of the dead. David is dead. And it doesn't say God isn't the God of David, but God is the God of David. You know what I mean? We know God is the God of David, right? He isn't the God of Og, king of Bashan. You know what I mean? No, not the God of Og. He's not the God of Goliath, but he is the God of David. I want you to consider this. How often in the scriptures are men that are dead, alive, called dead? Can you think of examples? You know? I mean, God, I'm not... the references don't necessarily leap to my mind, but I mean, come on. And the dead, dead works, the deadness of the members of your flesh, you who were dead in trespasses and sins. God is not the God of the dead. So here's what the question becomes. One, either Jesus or Peter were speaking metaphorically. You know what I mean? Like, let's say, for example, if Jesus is speaking literally, then he's saying, God is not God of people who are literally dead, but literally alive. But he's God of those who are literally alive. Therefore, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are literally alive right now. They're walking around somewhere. They're probably annoyed with me for teaching the wrong things. They're saying, there goes Paul again, confusing people, undermining tradition. There he goes. Either that is the interpretation, literally, and then now Peter, his has to be metaphorical. So he's saying David is metaphorically dead and metaphorically buried. He is literally in heaven, of course. Of course. That's where all the dead go to Abraham's bosom, like the righteous dead. And all the unrighteous dead live on in hell. Oh, wait. Are they literally dead or literally alive? See what I'm saying? When you interpret it that way, you get confusion. And I'm not just manipulating this. So you could say that, whatever. I'm gonna manipulate everything. Now let's look at it the other way. God is not the God of the dead. And he means this in a more metaphorical sense. Meaning, he's not God of the spiritually dead. Goliath, Sadducees, perhaps. Or the heathen, like you who were dead in trespasses and sins. Let me just bring that verse up in case it is not a familiar verse to everyone. Yeah. I mean, there's two references that come up right when I go dead trespass. Ephesians 2 verse 1. And you hath he quickened, who were dead in trespasses and sins, which in times past walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience. And that's deadness. He has made you alive, who were dead, because he's your God now. And he's God of the living. Now we have also Colossians 2 verse 13. This is a second witness. And you being dead. Oh, let's see, it never lines up right. And you being dead in your sins and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, hath he quickened together with him, having forgiven all your trespasses. Again, quickened means made alive. Cut to the quick, made to the living portion, So, okay. Let's follow this interpretation and see if we can even out the scriptures. See if it harmonizes these scriptures. Because the other point of view, here's one option you don't have as a Christian. You can't ignore either one of these passages. It's not acceptable. I get annoyed. It's like, I'll bring up, well, how do you explain Acts 2? Oh, Acts 2. God is not the God of that. He's God. They just throw it out. I find that unacceptable. Don't come, when people start saying, oh, it's God's holy, perfect word, I take it every word literally. I'm a fundamentalist. It's like, no, you're not. You're not. And I find that extremely distasteful. It's like your opinion is more important to you than what God's word actually says, and having an interpretation that actually makes sense across all the scriptures. You gotta have a script. You can't just toss out ones you don't like or just give some lame explanation. It's got to make sense. I have to be able to plug it in to the other one and say they make one thing. Now I'm going to say, let's say this is more spiritual, what Jesus has that. So he's like, he regards people who are not of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as dead in trespasses and sins, in the uncircumcision of their flesh, or in their wickedness, even though they be circumcised. They are dead. But Abraham, now metaphorically, they're metaphorically dead, even though they're literally alive. Now, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are literally dead. But because he is their God, they are metaphorically alive. And God sees them as alive because they will yet live again in resurrection. And you can plug that in to Acts where Peter makes it clear he's talking about literally things, because he says, let me speak plainly with you that David is both dead and buried. His sepulcher is right over there. You know what I mean? He's making it obvious he's not talking metaphorical death. And try to plug metaphorical death into that passage. I don't see how you do it. I don't see how you do it. This passage can be read metaphorically, and there are a lot of compelling reasons to do so. He's speaking to his enemies, and Jesus, when he speaks to his enemies, very often says things that could be interpreted different ways, and that are not, it's not obvious what he meant. He speaks in riddles. He does not respect them. So, the idea that you think you're going to say this is just literal, they're not dead, they're already in heaven. And because the Sadducees are thinking, we know where Abraham is buried. What do you mean he's living? Because there was still a belief in the resurrection, but people always got to get out ahead of things. They say, what do you mean? They just sit in the ground waiting forever? No, nobody's waiting for anything. There's no waiting. It's like going in, like I said, it's sort of like being thrown into a time machine. You die, and the next thing you know, you're in the future, and the resurrection is everybody. We all go to heaven at the same time. And I don't even like the term go to heaven, but we all are going to wake up at the same time. And that's that. And sleep is merely a metaphor. I don't believe in soul sleep. It's just, it's more like, I don't know what you call it. Someone described death to me, they thought of it as like a singularity, like all your experiences, all that you are, collapses down into singularity, whatever that means. Oh, wow, singularity. It sounds so futuristic and modern to say something like that. Like the universe came from a singularity, which is not distinguishable from nothing, but it is not nothing either. When I die, I'm not nothing. Even apart from my body, I'm not nothing. I had been something. But the question is, do I know anything? Do I see anything? And the scriptures say that that's not the case. At least Ecclesiastes says that dead don't know anything. And most of the Old Testament seems to give that impression, that death is death. But also there is this hope of redemption and resurrection, which certainly is more prevalent in the New Testament, but was not absent from the Old. So that's my interpretation of that. I think it fits much better. If you're going to tell me that means something else than what I say, that he meant it actually more spiritually, and he's playing with them also. If you don't agree with that, then you have to explain to me how then you reconcile what Jesus said with what Peter said. Because unless you interpret it my way, they're contradicting each other. You could say, oh, well, Peter was only speaking of his flesh. But actually, in that context, he talks about soul. He would not leave my soul in hell. And by hell there, he means the grave. That's what he's talking about. That's where hell is. That's where we get the idea of it straight down. But the word hell is just from Norse mythology. Hela, goddess of the underworld. So it's not a just like Hades isn't really a Hebrew idea. The Hades of the Greeks is nothing like the Sheol of the Hebrews, but the cultural clash changed what a lot of Hebrews thought. They adopted pagan ideas about the afterlife and the underworld. So God is not God of the dead, but God of the living. He is God of those who he regards as alive. Again, right now, if God is my God, I'm alive. But if God is not my God, I'm already dead. You know, I'm dead in trespasses. I have no life in me. I mean, there's so many scriptures like that. It's like, I think Jesus was on the metaphorical side. Peter was obviously speaking literally. David's literally dead, and he's literally buried, and his sepulcher is right over there. But he spoke of the Lord Jesus, that the Lord Jesus, his soul would not be left in hell, but he would be raised from the dead. Well, you know, so also we're going to be all raised from the dead someday. And when the multitude heard this, they were astonished at his doctrine. Because of the trick they're trying to make him look foolish, but he just denied. What he did is he sort of said, "It's not like on earth. They're going to be like the angels, you know, sort of asexual. You're not going to have a sex drive and sexual nature. There are other pleasures to be had in the world than those of the senses." Some people would think like, "Well, I don't want to ever do without that." Yeah. It won't even take any getting used to. You know, it's just a purely biological urge. Well, when the Pharisees had heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, then they were gathered together. It's 8 o'clock. I don't think we can go on. So they're going to tempt him some more. We'll get to the next temptation. Yep, and then we get to 23. Okay. So anyways, thanks for joining me in this study. I look forward to staying with you again tomorrow. And let me just pull up pertinent music for this. I think this makes sense.